Hello and welcome to the lectures here in the Archives and History Library. There we go. Before we get started this afternoon, though, I would like to announce our next month's lecture. It is going to be Monique Marie Chorash Kanazi. She is a West Virginia native. She graduated from Riverside High School. She is a author, professor, researcher, and Homeland National Security expert. At the moment, she teaches at the American Military Institute as an associate professor and advisor for the School of Security and Global Studies, and that will be on May 11th at 3 o'clock. This afternoon, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Kelli Shapiro here to speak on her book on the evolution of the West Virginia movie theater. Dr. Shapiro is a program associate at the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia and is dedicated quite a bit of time to the Historical Theater Trail, a heritage tourism initiative promoting the rehabilitation and sustainable operation of the state's historical theaters and enjoyment of the public.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Kelli Shapiro. I'm going to be presenting about the evolution of the West Virginia movie theater, and it's based on the book that I wrote for Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, where I work, Historic Movie Theaters of West Virginia. We have copies for sale here afterward, $20, and all proceeds go to the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, which is a nonprofit organization. So how is the presentation different from the book? Or why should you still be interested in hopefully buying the book once you've heard the presentation? So the book is structured to make specific theaters and specific cities very easy to find. It has regional chapters using the 9 regions established by the West Virginia Division of Tourism. So for instance, you want to find Charleston theaters, you look in the Metro Valley chapter. And then within those regional chapters, it's organized alphabetically by town. So, you know, the Metro Valley chapter starts off with Cabin Creek and Cerritos, and then moves to Charleston. So very easy to find what you're looking for. And within the larger cities, such as Charleston, Huntington, Morgantown, I generally try to do the theaters by year, so the oldest theaters, and then moving on to the later ones. So that's basically how that's structured. And so it's not thematic at all. Each picture is a historic picture of one theater, and then there's a historical information caption about the theater. So there's really nothing thematic or contextual about most of it, except for the introductions. But it's wonderful for learning just interesting facts, or at least I think it's wonderful. I hope you think it is, about these theaters and their importance in their communities. So the presentation, on the other hand, is more of an overview. It's a combination of chronological and topical. I'll be talking about the development of theaters as a type of place, as a building type, as an experience, essentially. So I'll be going through, design issues, the different types of theaters that evolved over the years, the changes they went through, the survival strategies they tried and often failed at, unfortunately. So overall, I'll be providing context for understanding the movie theater in West Virginia. And of course, I'll be using statewide examples to tell this story of the movie theater's rise, in large part its fall, at least for the single screen theaters, and of course, examples of preservation. Since we're a preservation organization, that's really near and dear to our hearts, and that's really why we wanted to put this book out, to advocate for the preservation and continued usage of these wonderful community resources. And if you want more information on the theaters that I'm mentioning here, most of them are featured in the book. So at the beginning stages of movie theater evolution, the first places to show films were often not movie theaters, or at least they did not start out as such. Across West Virginia, stage theaters, such as opera houses, playhouses, and vaudeville venues, began screening films in the early 1900s. Most retained their original function of hosting live performances, along with showing movies, at least for a number of years, at which point some or most switched entirely to film. And an example of that is Cottrell's Opera House in Thomas, It opened in 1902 and started playing films in 1915.
Are they still up? Are they still existing buildings?
Cottrell's is actually. There's several community organizations that have been fundraising for its restoration currently, actually. Yeah. New Historic Thomas is the organization that's working on that right now. So, a number of live theater venues changed their names when they started showing movies to reflect their new use, or most times their new code use. Example of that is the Opera House in Berkeley Springs. It opened in 1906, and it started playing movies 3 years later, 1909, and at that point it was renamed the Palace Theater. And you can tell it's the same building because of the arch there. And over here, you can't read this, but there's a movie poster, and then up here it says, Saturday night, 4 reels photo play. And then right over here, this sign that's hanging on the edge of the arch says notable photo players. And then it has images of silent movie stars. And of course, no, they didn't call them actors or stars, it was photo players. I just thought that was really interesting. So, the very first theater in the United States that opened exclusively to show movies was very close to West Virginia. It was called the Nickelodeon, and it opened in Pittsburgh in a former storefront in 1905. The films were actually projected on a sheet hanging on the wall. The owner/creator of the Pittsburgh Nickelodeon, his name was Harry Davis, he was very smart about this. He licensed the idea, and it spread nationally very quickly. And the name that he'd chosen, Nickelodeon, caught on for this type of theater all across the country. So the name combines Odeon, which was the Greek word for essentially a place to view something, such as a theater, and then nickel, which was the typical price of admission. And the star in Clarksburg here, you can see over, back, wrong button. Okay, so here's the Nickelodeon. There, you can see it says motion picture over here, and then here's the 5-cent sign. So they actually were a nickel at the beginning. So like the Nickelodeon in Pittsburgh, and like the Star here, they were generally a repurposed storefront in a larger building. They were not purpose-built. Some of them, well, a few of them, you can find some that were purpose-built, but that was pretty rare. In general, these were very tiny. As you can see here, it's just one little storefront. They were very rudimentary, and they were cheap to open, and they flourished for a brief time. That's the thing. They were generally very short-lived. The Star here was very early. It opened shortly after the Nickelodeon concept went wide, and it closed around 1915. So we're talking less than 10 years, and that was very common for Nickelodeons. They just sort of disappeared. So one interesting thing about Nickelodeons is that they frequently had very fantastical names to convey this sense of excitement and wonder that was created by this new form of entertainment. The idea was basically that these venues were opening up a whole new world to viewers through the movies. So here we have the one in Charleston, Dreamland. Of course, that's not the large, that's not the large building. That's the tiny little thing here. This was a historic hotel. And you can see here it says Dreamla, and that's as much as you can get of it. And then here we had Fairyland in Hinton, again, with the 5-cent sign. And another one that I wasn't able to include on this slide with a fantastical name was in Buchanan. It was called Wonderland. And as you'll note, with all three of those, the names had a very ephemeral quality to them, and that sort of was reflected in the theater's own lifespans, unfortunately. So all three of these opened between 1906 and 1912, and they were all closed by the early 20s. So we're talking somewhere between less than 10 years to not even 15 years. And again, very typical. One type of early movie theater that is barely remembered today, and that is very hard to find photographs of, even nationally speaking, is the airdrome or airdome. These were open-air theaters without ceilings and sometimes even without walls that were generally found on vacant lots in central business districts. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a photograph of a West Virginia airdome because, again, they're practically impossible to find photographs of, which is why I'm using this one for the slideshow. This was the King's Theater Airdrome in St. Louis, opened in 1912, and it was much, much larger and nicer and more solid looking than usual, which is probably why it actually got photographed and then why someone actually kept the photograph. Most of them were, again, just in small vacant lots, so they were very basic. They had movable chairs, folding type chairs or benches. They had a screen or often just a sheet on one of the walls of the adjacent buildings. And again, since it was a vacant lot, they generally had a dirt floor or maybe there'd be some sawdust laid out on it. So they were very inexpensive and easy to establish, but they had fundamental problems, as you can imagine. Sitting outdoors in the winter, unless maybe you were in Southern California, Florida, something like that, just was not desirable. And having this vacant lot sit vacant and unused part of the year was, of course, an inefficient use of space and money, causing most airdromes to fail quickly. Some open-air theaters, however, were later enclosed on their vacant lot, or they moved into a building elsewhere, thus changing their identity. That was the case with this one, the Airdome in Parkersburg. It opened in 1909 as an airdrome, presumably in the spring or the summer of 1909. And one interesting thing was that it did both movies and vaudeville. So you were having sort of an outdoor amphitheater experience with the live performance. And then about a year later, November 1910, its owners enclosed it and built a building on the site and reopened it. So it lasted barely a year, which means it would have been open for basically 2 summers, and that was as long as they could keep it going as an airdrome. The new building actually had 2 different names that it went by, more or less simultaneously, as you can see here. The blade sign, you can see it says Rome, that means that was Hippodrome, and then where it says Garden, it was called the Hip Garden Theater. And of course, the word garden in it, there's certainly nothing garden about it now, but it kind of refers back to its origins as an open-air theater. Another early theater type in West Virginia was the movie theaters that were in coal company towns and coal camps. Unlike movie theaters in most communities in West Virginia and the U.S., these were typically built by coal companies as part of multipurpose venues, built as one of the company town's amenities for miners and their families. They were often located on the second floor of these multipurpose buildings, and the buildings often included things such as a gym, a billiard hall, maybe a soda fountain, could even be a bowling alley. Some of them also had commercial uses in the building, a barber shop, a shoe store, I saw at one of them. And since space was kind of crucial in the coal camps, the movie theaters also served as auditoriums, holding events such as community meetings, mine safety lectures, things like that. And you often couldn't even tell that there was a theater in these multi-purpose buildings. So here, the YMCA building in Wyden, which is in Clay County, it was built in 1920 as a YMCA with the theater inside of it. And I mean, look at that. Would you have any idea at all that there was a movie theater in that? None. But the community knew, because of course they knew. They were there. Now, some of them did have a separate entrance. The Elbert Theater in the Elbert Coal Camp in McDowell County did have a separate entrance. And then some of the ones that were on the second floor would have like outdoor stairs going up to it. So it just depended on what the designers of the company town wanted. But as you can see from the Elbert Recreation Center there, these movie theaters were mostly very simple, very plain, totally unadorned. I mean, basically this has, it has a few lights, it has fans over the doors, and that's it. So in most, and these were very small, often, 100 and 200 seats. some even smaller. And you wouldn't think that they would have survived for long. And many of them wouldn't have if they'd actually been in a city. But in these coal camps, with the lack of competition and with the lack of easy access to other theaters because of the geographic isolation, often the difficult terrain, and of course the long working hours, these were the only game in town. So many of them actually lasted for a number of decades. Many of them even ended up surviving after the mines closed in their community because people were still living there, and then the theater would get bought out by an independent company. So. Aside from the isolated coal camps, in West Virginia's downtowns, competition became increasingly fierce. As time passed, much new construction occurred, with relatively older, smaller theaters, such as the Nickelodeons, often closing after larger, nicer showplaces opened nearby. In fact, by 1926, West Virginia had almost 400 movie theaters. And this postcard, as you can see, shows 4 movie theaters on the exact same block in Huntington. This is 4th Avenue at 10th Street. And going from left to right, look, you can see the blade signs. This is the Strand. Then over here, we have the Orpheum. Going across the street, we have the Palace. And then closest here, we have the State. So obviously you say, how did all of these manage to survive or compete, or did any of them manage to thrive or survive at all? And across West Virginia, places that had a similar situation, many didn't survive. Here, it worked partially because they were not all competing with each other. At least part of them were cooperating because they were all part of the same theater chains. Either originally, or what often happened was they would be bought out, and then they would be part of the same chain. So out of these 4 here, 2 of them were part of the Smith Amusement Company's circuit, and 3 of them were, at some point in their lifespans, part of the Hyman family's regional circuit. And theater chains were called circuits. And I should mention that if you've gone to one of the multiplexes that's owned by the Greater Huntington Theater Corporation, that's still the Hyman family. They've been operating movie theaters in West Virginia since the early, about 1910s. Really amazing, same family. So theaters that were in chains in the same area, they had an advantage here because the circuits could put different types of films aimed at different audiences in their various theaters in the same area. So for instance, out of the 4 of these, you're going to have your big Hollywood movies, your critically acclaimed films, your hits at the largest, nicest one. And then another one might have second-run films, B-movies, bargain films. Then another one, you might have, more family-oriented, your Saturday matinee crowd, your westerns, things like that. So it helped segment the audience and helped keep these theaters alive. Another aspect with chains is that a big advantage was that they did things together. So they were marketed together. They had joint booking of films, which made it much easier for them to get big releases. They were often managed collectively, and they could buy equipment jointly, which gave them generally better prices than they would have had as independents. The main theater chain, the most prominent one in West Virginia, was Alpine. They were based in Kingwood, and at their height in the post-World War II era, they had about 25 theaters in West Virginia. Almost all of them were called the Alpine. A number of them were theaters that they had purchased that were pre-existing, but when they did build their own, you can see here, they used very similar architecture, very similar marquees. So the Alpine and Ripley, and then this was originally the Alpine, later was the Seneca. These are in different parts of the state, but if you look, the parapets, very similar. The marquees, you can tell, practically identical. All they did was swap out the Alpine word for Seneca. And, so had this sort of consistent branding going on. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the common features of typical downtown or neighborhood movie houses in the post-Nickelodeon era, and what sets these apart from the Nickelodeons. The arrival of sound in the late 1920s caused a massive shift for theaters. To be able to play sound films required brand new, costly equipment. Many small, older theaters, like Nickelodeons, across the state simply closed instead of making the expensive transition to being able to show the talkies. And if they did reopen with sound, they often got new names at that point, and owners might also do a remodel, interior, exterior, at that point as well. Sound's arrival was such a big deal that theaters would sometimes even announce its coming with advertisements such as this one, which is this huge painted wall sign that basically takes almost the entire side of the building at the Smoot Theater in Parkersburg. And it's now beautifully restored, as you can see the wall sign, and the Smoot itself, wonderful preservation success story. And as you can see, it's advertising that it uses the Vitaphone and Movietone sound systems, and those were both owned and sold by Warner Brothers, which the Smoot was actually part of the Warner Brothers national circuit at the time. And other theaters used, a number of theaters used Movietone and Vitaphone, and a number used, at this time there were a number of different sound systems competing, and a lot of which have never been heard of since. And so there was a lot of disagreement about, which ones were the best, which theater got this one, which theater got that one. So another typical feature of movie houses in the late 1920s and 30s was eye-catching architecture inside and out, especially the new style known as Art Deco. Many older theaters used a variety of traditional architectural styles or were simply standard commercial buildings. Again, the storefronts or things that basically just looked like typical downtown buildings. But these were meant to be noticed as new and fresh and exciting. And that went beyond the architecture to even the colors used. Many of these were quite colorful, especially through the use of vitrolite, as seen here at the Fairmont Theater in Fairmont. Vitrolite, which was manufactured here in West Virginia and used on buildings across the country, almost entirely commercial buildings, it was pigmented structural glass tiles, like these shiny peach ones here. There's peach, and then there's a row of cream at the top here at the Fairmont. And these came in a variety of colors. The most prominent examples in Charleston, of course, you have the Courier Diner with its burgundy vitrolite, and then also the Blossom Dairy Company, and both of those have been restored. And if a theater didn't start out being Art Deco, many of them were remodeled during this era to become Art Deco, as with the Manos in Elkins. It originally opened as the Grand Theater in 1909, and it got this remodel and its new name in 1938. Theater marquees became typical during this era, and they evolved too. The Nickelodeons that you saw earlier mostly didn't even have awnings. You really only knew they were a theater because of the poster boards out front, or maybe a lighted sign, or maybe a ticket booth, but many of the storefront ones didn't have those outside. Slightly later, theaters often had an awning-like marquee, such as the one here at the Lyric Theater. They were skinny, with no room for movie titles. And you could also see that at the two Alpine marquees in the earlier slide. All it said was the name of the theater. So they relied on posters in poster cases or poster boards or banners that were often attached to the bottom of the marquee to promote their films, with the idea being that pedestrians would stop as they walked past to stand under the awning, blocked from the rain or the snow, and just read the information. So these theaters, like the Lyric, like the Alpines that you saw, they, like the Nickelodeons, were very pedestrian-oriented. And of course, much of this was only helpful for pedestrians during the daytime. I mean, unless it was very well lighted, you're not going to be able to stop easily and be reading what's the poster board, who's starring in it, you know. So it was not automobile oriented. So a bit later, what we understand today to be a movie theater marquee came along, such as we see here at the Strand. So these were large structures with room for changeable letters to promote the movies, and they were often shown on 2 or 3 sides of the marquee so that people in passing cars could quickly and easily see what was playing and who starred in it from whatever direction they were driving. Lighting, especially neon, was crucial too, with the night glow really making the theater and its offerings stand out and show up. Again, this is, I mean, driving down the street in Parkersburg, you could not help but notice that. Your eye is just drawn to it. It's so. Also expected at typical movie houses in the post-Nickelodeon period was the interior lobby, where people could congregate out of the weather while waiting for a film to start. They could get information about coming attractions, such that these beautiful Art Deco poster cases at the Apollo, and crucially, they could buy food and snacks at the concession stand. The snack bar was typically a major profit generator for theaters, a big part of their business, just as it is today. And the snacks there, such as the popcorn machine, seen behind the employee at the Guyan, and you can kind of, so it's right here. It's an Art Deco, probably a Manly popcorn machine. And if you've been to the Star in Berkeley Springs, which is still open, they still have their 1940s Manly popcorn machine doing popcorn, and it's beautiful. It's Art Deco, it's gorgeous. Anyway, so the snacks, especially the popcorn, became this key part of the movie-going experience for the audience members. One feature the many larger downtown and neighborhood movie houses had that Nickelodeons typically didn't was a balcony. Most people don't really think much about balconies one way or the other. They're just kind of there, but they're significant because they were typically a site of segregation. The balcony was often reserved exclusively for African Americans, at least at larger theaters, or at least in smaller theaters. In large balconies, very large theaters, they generally have to sit at the back of the balcony. You'd have a few rows reserved. And these segregated seating areas often had separate upstairs bathrooms and even separate entrances for the African American patrons. As shown by this sign that once hung at the Granada in Bluefield. Separate entrance, possibly separate admission prices. And this is actually sitting now in the collection of the Eastern Regional Coal Archives, which is at the Kraft Memorial Library in Bluefield. So it's wonderful that they saved that to showcase part of this sad history. The type of seats might even be different in the balcony from the ones in the auditorium. At McCoy's Grand, which is now a playhouse, the balcony is mostly used for, storing props and things like that. But they made sure to leave a couple of these small wooden seats in the balcony just to show what sitting there was like for African Americans. Now downstairs in the theater's they have new seats in the auditorium, but in the theater's lobby, they saved and put a few of the regular theater seats, the historic ones, and those were very plush, velvet, traditional theater seats. Very different, much more comfortable than these small, wooden, hard ones in the balcony. So, something to think about. Moving briefly from typical downtown movie houses to theaters that were geared primarily toward the African American community in West Virginia during the segregation era. Across the state, a number of these did exist. And, these were wonderful places where the African American community could come and congregate and actually get to sit in the front row and, by 1954, there were about 10 of them open statewide. Unfortunately, I was only able to find an archival image of one of them for the book, and Arcadia Publishing's Images of America series, they insist that only historical photographs are used in the books. So, anyway, so I was, thankfully, here at the State Archives, they have the collection of the architect who designed this, This is the Ferguson Theater. You probably already can figure out it was in the block in Charleston, African-American neighborhood. And it was designed by John C. Norman, who was himself African-American. He designed a number of buildings at West Virginia State University. He designed several other movie theaters in West Virginia, of course, which he either couldn't go in or would have had to have sat in the back, except at this one. And the Ferguson Theater was actually inside the Ferguson Hotel, which was catered to African Americans. So basically a Green Book type of situation. And these were the employees at the time. So just a really fascinating part of cultural history in West Virginia. But I think it's important for all of us to remember.
Do you have a year on that?
This photograph? I found the year on that photograph based on looking up what year West of the Rio Grande came out. I'd have to Google it again. But remind me afterward and I can Google it. I want to say 40s or 50s. It burned down in the 60s, unfortunately. So soon, with all of the competition going on, theater owners and architects began to realize that in order to compete, a theater had to do more than simply beat the others in its town in terms of comfort, cleanliness, and even the quality of films shown. It had to provide the audience with a better overall entertainment experience. And the arrival of this experience concept marked one of the most important changes in movie theater history, moving from the storefront theater to the picture palace. Until the Great Depression took hold, architects experimented with styles that spanned the ages and the globe, creating fantastical, luxurious, and comparatively massive structures. Of course, the best example in West Virginia is the Keith Albee in Huntington, which is, of course, wonderfully restored today, thankfully. It was designed by a nationally renowned theater architect, Thomas Lamb, 1928. And as you can see here from the lobby of the auditorium, it had Spanish Baroque architecture, very ornate. And the auditorium these were called atmospheric style auditoriums when they were built in picture palaces, because the idea was that it was essentially imitating being out in the atmosphere. So this was meant to resemble a Spanish courtyard environment underneath a starry sky. And you can see the lighted stars up there oh, that's still on. Is anyone seeing the little red dot? It's too high up. Okay, yes. There we go. Anyway, glowing stars. And the fascinating thing about this to me is that the atmospheric style theaters really harkened back to the airdrome era and understood that people liked being in that sort of environment. It was freeing, it was open, it was inviting. It was very relaxing, but it didn't have all of the drawbacks of the airdrome. You could enjoy being under a starry sky, but not deal with rain, snow, mosquitoes. So very interesting way of taking that and making it very upscale, whereas the airdromes were very generally working class oriented. And of course, picture palaces were generally massive. The Keith Albee had over 2,600 seats. The Capitol in Wheeling, of course, which has also been very nicely restored, had about 3,000. So massive, really.
I just looked up West of the Rio Grande, came out in 1944.
1944. All right, good to know. And of course, it's quite likely that at an African-American theater, they would have gotten the movie's second run, because getting first-run movies is hard enough for many theaters that weren't part of chains. So at an African-American theater, you can imagine it could have been 1945, 1946. But yeah, thank you for looking that up. All right, now we know. So these massive picture palaces complemented their architecture with extravagant stage shows, orchestras, etc., to the point where the specific film playing was practically incidental to what surrounded it. And although these glamorous theaters were relatively affordable for the audience members, most were built in large cities or cities with a generally affluent population where they would fit well into the local self-conception and lifestyle. And so, of course, that doesn't really fit what we think of Welch today, but during Welch's heyday in the 1940s, it did. And so here we have the Pocahontas Theater on the left. And the Pocahontas was a picture palace, over 1,000 seats. And this is a very, some of you may have seen this photograph, it's fairly famous. This is, it's a weekend in Welsh in the 40s, and it's alive and vibrant, and it's packed with working people who actually had money to spend on entertainment. They had free time and they had money. And so it was really this symbol of how well the community was doing. And just as a side note, across the street here we have the Temple Theater, which was built as part of the Masonic Temple, or sorry, the Oddfellows Temple, which you can see the sign here. It was much older, much smaller, but it survived against the much larger, much more beautiful Pocahontas, because as you can tell by the fact that they have this theater sign going across connecting them, they were part of the same chain. It was the Rogers Circuit, and Rogers would send the Hollywood blockbusters to the Pocahontas, and the Temple was known for its Saturday matinees and its westerns. At many points they said they actually didn't have a working bathroom, and they would just send people across the street to the Pocahontas because it was easier than fixing the bathroom. So, you had this hierarchy really going on. In the post-World War II era, audiences began departing downtown and neighborhood movie theaters alike, and picture palaces as well, for a new form of theater, the drive-in, which was better suited to and would become an icon of the growing car culture. West Virginia's first drive-in, Beckley's Open Air Drive-In, opened in 1947. Unfortunately, I was not able to find an archival picture of that one, and so could not do more than mention it in the introduction of the book. I was sad about that. But, so improving on the earlier airdrome idea, again, heading back outside, drive-ins flourished post-war, especially as a very casual place where parents could feel comfortable taking their children during the baby boom era. By 1969, the state had 77 drive-ins, such as the Greenbrier Drive-In Theater, right along the river. The river's literally right behind it, in Hinton. Taking marketing and design lessons from their indoor competitors, drive-in owners often made their few exterior structures, such as their screens and their freestanding marquees, into self-advertisements and eye-catching works of art. These two were both designed by Alex Mahood, probably West Virginia's most important architects, who designed, of course, numerous buildings, especially in the south of the state. And he also designed a number of indoor theaters as well, including Bluefield's Moorish-style picture palace, the Granada. Here, you see some of his features on both of them. You have these streamlined modern portholes. Portholes were a common feature, of course, of Art Deco and streamlined modern. Here you can just vaguely see these little dots. These are actually neon stars, red neon at night. And over here, it's hard to see, but there's a mural of mountains here on the skyline. And then over here on the freestanding marquee, we have this big arrow, which would have been lighted at night, pointing toward the theater. So all of those elements were meant to catch the eyes of people in passing cars and make them want to stop and go to a movie. So then we come to the transition period, or the period of the fall of most single-screen movie theaters. For several decades, patrons flocked to drive-ins while indoor theater attendance dropped, but changes were occurring that would soon make all of these previous movie theater forms much less viable. Some of the most commonly cited causes were the arrival of the TV set, and then color TV, cable, the VCR, and on it went. However, across America, one of the most important reasons was suburbanization. This was due in large part to the 1956 creation of the interstate highway system. Interstates wreaked havoc on businesses, including theaters, located on what were previously regional thoroughfares, including drive-ins and theaters in historic downtowns that got bypassed. Of course, suburbanization was slightly less an issue in West Virginia than some places, but and the rise of multiplex theaters, needless to say, with more screens and more convenience, particularly those located at highway exits, especially in new shopping centers, was a harbinger of death for many single-screen drive-ins and indoor theaters as well. Redevelopment was also an issue due to the rising value of land in areas that were developing, especially drive-ins that had previously been on the outskirts of town that then became surrounded by suburban development. The Cerrado drive-in was a casualty of this. It was the Huntington area's first drive-in, and it was demolished in 1975 for a shopping center. And FYI, if you're looking at aerial photographs and you happen to see anything with this pie shape, the pie shape with a little tiny thing at the end here, that is always a drive-in. And went through lots of aerials for this book, always just looking for that pie shape, and I would be so excited when I found one. So this was demolished for a shopping center, and both of the Alex Mahood design drive-ins on the earlier slide were also demolished for shopping centers. Downtown redevelopment efforts were also a problem, as many theaters downtown were demolished for parking lots or new construction. The Ritz Theater in Clarksburg, which was a picture palace with over 1,000 seats, you see it here with its wrecking crane in the middle of being about to demolish the very beautiful sort of Gothic style top. This was 1975 when it was demolished for the new county library. Of course, in much of West Virginia, downtown development and suburban growth wasn't the issue. Widespread job losses and the resulting population exodus from multiple areas in the state were the major factors in numerous theaters' closings, leaving them to often just sit vacant and decay in increasingly abandoned downtowns. And then, sorry, I forgot to print this slide. It's on my phone here. Okay, so many theaters in West Virginia, however, simply fell because of outside forces, especially natural disasters, such as being ruined in floods. Beckley's Lyric Theater here was a rare case, and it was actually demolished twice due to more or less natural causes. The first time was when it was only 4 years old, 1924, when it was destroyed in a fire that turned out to be arson, which also damaged another local theater. The arsonist really did not like theaters, unfortunately. The owners rebuilt, and the replacement building, which was this one, survived for decades very nicely as a movie theater and then as commercial space until it collapsed during a blizzard. So the Lyric, really very unlucky, that building. So how did theaters try to stay operational during this era of change? There were multiple survival strategies employed by theaters across West Virginia. For drive-ins, some found at least temporary success by adding a daytime usage in their large parking lots, swap meets. But as seen here, where the Fort Drive-In's marquee became an advertisement not for films, but for the site's flea market, and again, this would have been the movie show times, but definitely not. Instead it says, open Saturday and Sunday, and says that, booths are welcome, sales are welcome. So in this case, that daytime use couldn't save the theater financially. And this flea market, as you can tell, it actually continued for years beyond the property's time as a movie venue. But it also closed and was demolished, the remaining structures, a few years ago, unfortunately. For indoor theaters, one survival tactic was remodeling, often along with a renaming, trying to make something old seem, or as we'd like to say now, historic, but back then they just saw it as old. Trying to make that seem new and fresh, like their suburban competitors were. Interior remodels might include upgrades to the sound system or the seats, while outside, the historic facades were often significantly transformed or at least covered over. Using metal slipcovers, like this one, was a simple way to drastically change a building's appearance, as seen here when the Rex was turned into the Coronet. But people didn't flock back to most of these remodeled downtown theaters. They stayed in the suburbs. And the Coronet was demolished, as were many of them. But when they did the demolition, seeing pictures in the newspaper, when they removed the metal screening, you could still see that it had most of the historic elements on there. A few of those were salvaged and taken by private people, basically, but mostly gone. Yes?
Was the whitish building in the original, is that was that the theater?
Oh, yes, and the marquee is just wonderful. And of course, they took off the marquee when they renamed it the Coronet, and again, they're sort of back to the thing where there was no room even to put the names of the movies on that. But yeah, and you can actually, you see the top here with these ball elements, you can kind of see them under here. You can see the parapet edge, and it's all just hidden back there behind that screen. Yeah. So when remodeling didn't save a theater, another step was to shift away from showing pricey first-run films and go toward screening second-run movies at a discount, which was much cheaper, of course, for the theaters to get. And that's what occurred here at Huntington's former Orpheum, which you saw back in that postcard, looking nothing at all like this, which was later known as the Cinema Theater. And again, sort of like the Coronet not having a marquee, it's sort of like they gave up. I mean, Cinema Theater, you could not have a less original name if you tried. But the remodel, the new name, the discount films, that didn't help. Most theaters that became these dollar theaters, they still didn't survive for long. And the cinema was one of the ones that tried it and then closed fairly recently. While dollar theaters appealed to moviegoers who wanted or needed bargain entertainment, such as large families, working class, and were a great option for them, other theaters tried to reach a different niche audience by playing adult films. That was the case with the Custer Theater on Charleston's west side, what's now the Elk City Historic District, which in 1975 was renamed the New Lyric and started playing X-rated movies. And you can't really see it, but okay, so it says adult entertainment, late show Saturday, and then above that it says the two movies that are playing, which were Visions, which sounds innocuous enough, you'd never really know, and then the second one was called Honeymoon Haven, so you can kind of, I haven't looked them up, I didn't really want to look them up, but so the New Lyric here only survived about 10 years with its focus on the adult film clientele. And that was longer than many similar venues lasted in West Virginia. Generally due to local controversy, but also due to some Supreme Court decisions about how local obscenity laws could be put in place, and mostly they failed. Some of the ones that failed just ended up closing, like this. Some of them would end up going back to regular movies for a little bit, and then they would close. But
Yeah, for $1. Mm-hmm. Somebody reopened it and showed second or third run movies for $1.
Yeah, they call it the Rialto. It was open for a few years. Yeah, like in the mid-90s,
Yeah.
96.
so it was open at some point afterward. Good to know.
I went there a lot.
At that point.
Well, at that point, yeah, at that point. Before that, too.
Yeah, cool. And I've been inside it recently, and I will get to that a little bit later. So moving from those to places that did not turn adult, thankfully. So some of the larger single-screen indoor theater operators decided to compete head-on with their new competition, the multiplexes, by multiplexing their own theaters. At the Warner in Morgantown, Picture Palace with over 1,000 seats, its beautiful Art Deco auditorium was divided up into 3 smaller film venues, each with their own screens. So they split the downstairs in 2, basically put a wall right between those 2 rows of seats, and then they separated off the balcony, again, put a wall right across it, put a screen on it. And a number of the larger theaters did that, and all the attempts at this in West Virginia failed long term. More screens just weren't enough to keep these theaters competitive. And part of that was that you really lost the experience. You lost the design, and the thing is, the design wasn't just the architect, wasn't just the, the fancy architecture. Theater architects, you had to think a lot about things like sight lines. You're always picking out what seats have the best view of the screen, right? And the best sound and all of that. And when you just sort of randomly cut things in half, put walls, put up screens, they were not thinking about, what the sight lines were or how the sound was. A lot of the walls didn't really block the sound, so you'd see reviews from some of the ones that had been multiplexed, and you'd say, well, you can hear the sound from the other theater just as well as you can hear the one in our theater. So, there were definite reasons why that didn't work out. So, what happened to historic movie theaters that closed? Of course, many have been demolished, but some are still sitting vacant today, essentially intact, just waiting for some developer, nonprofit, or city agency to come along and take advantage of preservation grants, historic tax credits, and other financial incentives to sensitively rehabilitate and reopen them for community enjoyment once again. In fact, that's happening in several cities in West Virginia right now. Unfortunately, not these two, which are still just sitting there as they have been. But again, there's potential. So there have been examples of theater preservation and reopening, a number of them in the state. And here we have Warner's Drive-In in Franklin, which is over in eastern part of the state. And it closed in 2014 when its owners couldn't afford to go digital. That was the point in time when the theaters, all movie theaters nationally, were hit by a huge costly upgrade necessity. Because it was at that point, 2014, 2015, that all the main studios in the country started only shipping films digitally, or so no more film reels. And of course, this was very costly at the time. You're talking maybe $75,000 for a digital projector, and a lot of your small independent theaters just couldn't afford it. And the Warner's was one of the many that closed during this period. But locals, of course, in this very rural, isolated area, they wanted their drive-in. And so, in really a wonderful success story, they formed a nonprofit organization, started accepting donations, doing fundraising, and actually raised enough money to buy a digital projector and reopen with first-run movies in summer 2016. So, very happy to see that happening. And the most recent example of indoor theaters restoration and reopening is the Robinson Grand in Clarksburg, which opened less than a year ago. It had been closed for decades, and the city of Clarksburg, they bought it. They did this multi-million-dollar project using lots of different grant sources, lots of donations, historic tax credits, federal and state level, and reopened it as a venue for they've already had lots of major concerts, major performances. They also do classic film nights, things like that, and a lot of their events have sold out, which is just wonderful to see. And it's really been contributing to the revitalization of downtown Clarksburg, bringing in visitors from outside, bringing in new business. So, again, that's a real success story. And my organization, the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, we're actually having our annual banquet, our annual awards banquet, and our annual keynote speech at the Robinson Grand in September. And we're really looking forward to being there and celebrating that. So as you saw with the Robinson Grand, even though it's no longer playing movies, or at least not playing new movies, it's still very much contributing to essentially the vitality of community life. And that has happened with a lot of movie theaters nationally that have become these live performance venues. That's basically the most common adaptive reuse of historic movie theaters. And that type of conversion actually brings the buildings full circle, returning them back to this pre-film conceptualization of going to the theater, or at least it takes them back to the era when films and vaudeville coexisted, or when silent films were accompanied by a piano or an orchestra. And approximately 20 former movie theaters across the state, including the once long-closed Fayette, now host plays, concerts, and other performing arts, helping draw people back downtown providing important cultural and educational opportunities for the community, and just enriching community life. So here's a familiar one. Meanwhile, numerous historic theaters have been preserved through other forms of adaptive reuse, with their structures surviving, even though their original functions have changed. Some have been converted to office space, including, of course, the State Theater on the East End, and the formerly X-rated New Lyric, or the Custer, both of which got facade restorations as part of the conversion process. Other former movie theaters became stores, as seen here with the New Star Theater in Richwood, which you can see still has the name and the really nice star logo above it there. And when theaters become stores, which also happened with the Manos and Elkins, it really reverses the Nickelodeon era concept of existing storefronts becoming theaters. Here you have theaters becoming essentially storefronts. So it's interesting. Still other former movie theaters have become restaurants, bars, and nightclubs, like the Art Deco Kanawha Theater in Buchanan, which looks practically like it did in its heyday. Not inside, admittedly, but from the exterior at least. Another familiar one. So because of the fact that they're essentially just auditoriums inside, closed movie theaters are ideal settings for becoming sanctuaries for churches, as has recently happened in 2018 at the former Capitol Theater here, which was, of course, formerly run by West Virginia State University for a performance space for the students, film festivals, things like that. And the Cinema Theater in Huntington, which closed after that box-like remodel that you saw, and then after showing second-run films for a number of years, it now hosts a church as well. Whoops, okay, there we go. So only a handful of single-screen movie theaters still operate as such in West Virginia today. Some having closed and later reopened, but some having just kept on going as they always were. There are 5 operational drive-ins in the state, all only open seasonally, and most of them are opening this weekend, later this month, in May, so please go out and support them. The oldest is Harrison County's Sunset Drive-In there, which opened in 1947, and it's been run by the same family since the 50s, the Ellis family, and it's still going strong, providing a nostalgic movie-going experience. And there are also half a dozen indoor historic movie theaters that still regularly show new films today, mostly just on the weekends. The most singular of those is the Roby Theater in Spencer, which has been operating, admittedly with 3 different names and in 2 different locations in Spencer, since Hammond Roby opened it in 1907. And according to national movie theater scholars and national historic theater organizations, it is the oldest continuously operated movie theater in America, period. And that's not just me saying it. Again, this is known nationally, and that's a wonderful thing for West Virginia to have. So the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia celebrates and supports sites like the Roby, the Sunset Drive-In, and the Fayette through its West Virginia Historic Theater Trail, a statewide thematic tour of almost 30 open historic theaters, which includes both cinemas and live performance venues, such as the Muni, for instance. This heritage tourism initiative promotes the rehabilitation and sustainable operation of the state's historic theaters for the enjoyment of the public. And all of the theaters on the Historic Theater Trail are either listed in or have been determined officially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So please check out the trail and its theaters on the web or on Facebook. And I also have Theater Trail rat cards right here, so please pick some up. And to find out more about the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia's many other programs and services beyond the West Virginia Historic Theater Trail, here is our contact information. That's my email at the end there. And I also have Preservation Alliance route cards over here. And I'll now be selling and signing the Historic Movie Theaters of West Virginia book for $20 each. And again, all proceeds go to our nonprofit organization. So thank you so much for coming.
Would you care to take some questions?
Yes,
if anybody has
absolutely.
any?
Yes. Any questions? The questions? All right. Oh, yes, question.
How much do you think the development of TV hurt the movie industry? I mean, you talked a lot about loss of jobs and people moving, but I would imagine TV took a little bit of business away.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when TV hit, when it became popular enough to be in most homes, I mean, at that point, if you could see movies at home without having to go, especially for things like the picture palaces, people would generally dress up to go. So if you didn't have to dress up, if you didn't have to get your kids dressed, if you didn't have to pay all of that extra money, especially if you had a large family, that was certainly a major incentive to just stay home. And of course, having TV shows with, of course, you know, in early movie theaters, you generally had the serials, you know, you'd come back every week to see these continuing stories. And if you could get that on TV for free, again. So a lot of the incentive to go to movie theaters really dropped at that point. Although, of course, what they're now saying about you know, watching TV on the phone is the same thing as much better to see it, you know, you want to see the spectacle, especially on the big screen, as opposed to on your phone. Well, back then they were trying to make the same argument about the TV. You need to see it here, not here, because you lose so much of the cinematography and the special effects, and you know, and so they were very much still making that same argument that's still being made today about not just seeing everything on Netflix and actually going to a theater. So, yes. Oh, I should know better than to clap my hands near a microphone. Okay, I will avoid doing that. Any other questions? Yes.
I might make a comment about serials.
Sure.
Some of you may not know what they are.
Right.
But they were, as you said, episodic. They maybe were 9 episodes, 7 episodes. And they literally kind of perfected the term cliffhanger sometimes. Because literally the villain would be, or the hero would be on a cliff. The next scene would just show him stepping off a ledge and onto the trail and going his merry way. I mentioned something about serials. I was watching some on public television, and I mentioned them to my dad. And he said, yes. And that was because Dad didn't have enough money to go to the theater every week. In order to really make the serials work, you had to be wealthy enough to go every week, which many people were. If you were not, you saw maybe episode 3 and 8 or something, you know. It just didn't work the same. But in the day, in addition to serials, you had cartoons, had a 7.5-minute newsreel many times. So it was quite an experience. Maybe even had a short sometimes. So there were all these things you would see for the feature. And now we just go and see the feature and whatever they want to show us before. But the theaters are a fascinating experience. We certainly appreciate your coming and sharing your expertise with us on West Virginia theaters and
Thank you.
highlighting the ones that are still around.
Thank you, thank you. And yeah, that's another thing too, just even saying that the cartoons before the movies. I mean, once you got Saturday morning TV for the kids, the cartoons, they didn't need to go to the Saturday morning matinee anymore. So again, TV, a huge impact. So, any other? All right, well, if anyone feels like buying a book or just looking through a book for later, right here. So thank you so much. Have a nice day, everyone.